It took only 1 second, one sharp stinging slap, to shatter a bond forged in blood and sacrifice. That night, the silence wasn't peaceful, it was a grave. A mother's rage, born of terrifying love, drove her only child into the swallowing darkness, leaving behind an empty hut that would echo with 10 long years of unanswered prayers and a silence loud enough to deafen the soul. At the very edge of the village of St. Jude's, where the paved road surrendered to the wild overgrowth of the forest, stood a hut so dilapidated it seemed held together only by the memory of better days. The mud walls had crumbled in patches, revealing the skeletal bamboo beneath like an old wound that refused to heal. The thatched roof was broken, a sieve that offered no shelter when the heavens opened up during the monsoon, letting the cold rain weep onto the floor. Inside this crumbling shell lived an old woman, Maria. She must have been around 70. Though time had been cruel, carving its passage deep into her skin. Her back was permanently bent, as if carrying an invisible burden she could never set down. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, a milky haze that veiled the world, yet her face wore not just wrinkles, but the clear, legible script of a decade of. The villagers knew her as Mother Maria, but now, there was hardly anyone left to call her that with affection. The one person for whom she had breathed, for whom she had fought the world, had vanished into the night 10 years ago and never looked back. Maria's life now dangled by a thread, sustained only by the pity of strangers. A neighbor might spare 2 pieces of bread, another might drop a worn-out shawl at her door. Sometimes, the women returning from the evening service at the church would leave a handful of rice, and that was how she survived. Every morning, without fail, she would sit outside her hut on a broken cot. In her trembling hands, she held an old, worn rosary, her lips moved in prayer to God, while her dim eyes fixed themselves on the dusty path that led out of the village. It was a ritual of heartbreak, a stubborn hope, that perhaps today, just maybe today, her son David would return. But little did she know that the boy who left would indeed return, but not as the son she remembered. He would not return as the boy who ran away in shame, but as the District Magistrate, the highest authority in the entire region. To understand this tragedy, we must turn the clock back 10 years. Maria was the wife of a simple laborer named Joseph. Joseph was a good man, a hard worker who toiled in the brick kilns in the fields of the landlords, earning just enough to keep the fire in their hearth burning. They had little, but they had each other, and they had their son David. But life, in its unpredictable cruelty, struck without warning. A sudden illness seized Joseph. The fever raged like a fire in his blood. There was no money for a city doctor and the village clinic was bare. In just a few days, Joseph breathed his last, leaving Maria a widow, in a world that had no mercy for the weak. On the day they lowered Joseph's coffin into the holy ground of the cemetery, Maria stood by the grave, tears streaming down her face, and made a silent vow to God. She swore that no matter how much she had to suffer, she would not let her son David stray. She would raise him to be a man of honor. At that time, David was only 6 years old. Innocent, naive, and completely unaware that the fire of his father's loss would eventually burn his own future. Maria began to work in the homes of others. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw. She worked in the paddy fields under the scorching sun. She washed mountains of dishes. She did everything but beg, for she wanted David to hold his head high. She would often eat half a piece of bread and drink a glass of water, telling David she wasn't hungry, just so he could sleep with a full belly. Time passed, and David grew. But as he grew, something dark began to take root in his heart. It was a bitterness born of poverty. He hated their rags, he hated the pity in the villagers' eyes, and most of all, he hated his mother's strictness. Maria was terrified that without a father, David would fall into bad company. The village of St. Jude's had its share of delinquents, boys who gambled, drank, and wasted their lives. To protect him, Maria became a fortress of discipline. She scolded him, she lectured him, and sometimes she even raised her hand to him. But every time she struck him, her own heart bled. She knew that if she wasn't hard on him today, the world would be merciless to him tomorrow. But David, in the arrogance of his youth, could not see the fear behind her anger. He only saw the cage, not the protection. The breaking point came on the night of David's 16th birthday. He had gone out with the very boys Maria had warned him against. Hours passed, and he didn't return. Maria sat by the door, the oil lamp flickering in the wind, her heart pounding with dread. It was late, past midnight, when David finally stumbled into the courtyard. The smell of cheap liquor hit Maria before he even spoke. His eyes were bloodshot, his steps unsteady. Seeing her son, her hope, her life, in such a state broke something inside her. The fear that he was becoming lost took over. In a fit of uncontrollable rage and disappointment, Maria grabbed him by the collar. "Is this what I starved for?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Is this why I worked like a donkey? So you could become a drunkard?" David, emboldened by the alcohol, shoved her hand away and muttered something disrespectful. That was it. Maria's hand flew across his face. Smack! The sound echoed through the silent night. "Get out!" she cried, pointing to the darkness. "If this is who you are not my son. You are dead to me. I would rather be childless than have a son who brings shame to his father's name." Those words, those terrible, heavy words, they were spoken in heat, meant to shock him into sobriety, but they pierced David's heart like a poisoned arrow. He didn't shout back. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, looking at his mother with a cold, hollow stare. He waited until she went inside, sobbing, and lay down on her mat. He waited until her breathing evened out into a restless sleep. Then, in the silence of the night, David packed a small bundle of clothes. He took one last look at his sleeping mother, his eyes burning with tears he refused to shed, and stepped out into the darkness. He walked away from the hut, away from the church, away from St. Jude's, without looking back once. The next morning, when Maria woke up, the silence in the hut was deafening. "David," she called out, expecting him to be sulking in a corner. But the cot was empty. She checked the backyard. Empty. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped her chest. She ran to the fields, she ran to the neighbors. "Have you seen my David?" she asked, her voice trembling. But no one had seen him. Hours turned into days. She went to the police station. She begged the priest at the church to pray. She searched every face in the market. But David was gone. As the months turned into years, the light in Maria's eyes began to dim. She aged rapidly, her body shrinking under the weight of her grief. Eventually, she accepted the terrifying possibility that her son was lost forever, perhaps dead. But a mother's heart is a stubborn thing. It kept a tiny flicker of hope alive, a candle burning in a hurricane. Meanwhile, David had reached the city. The city was a beast, loud and indifferent. He was alone, hungry and terrified. But the memory of that slap, and those words, "You are not my son," burned in his gut. It became fuel. He started by washing dishes at a roadside stall, sleeping on the cold pavement with stray dogs as his companions. He carried bricks at construction sites, his young shoulders bleeding. But every night, under the yellow glow of streetlights, David studied. He bought second-hand books with his meager earnings. He possessed a madness, a singular obsession to prove that he was not a failure. He wanted to become someone so big that the poverty of his village would look like a speck of dust beneath his feet. Years rolled by. The boy became a man. The softness of his face was replaced by a hardened jawline, and the confusion in his eyes was replaced by a steely resolve. He worked during the day and studied at night, consuming knowledge like a starving man consumes bread. He passed exams, climbed the ladder, and finally he cracked the toughest examination in the country. The boy who had run away with nothing but shame was now appointed as the District Magistrate. David was now Sir. He was the law. He was power. He had a government bungalow, a car with a beacon, and an army of servants. But inside, the void remained. He had never gone back. He had never written. Pride and a deep-seated fear that his mother hated him kept him away. But God has a way of bringing us back to where we belong. It was a Tuesday afternoon. David sat in his expansive, air-conditioned office, surrounded by stacks of files. He was known as a strict officer, one who never smiled. His subordinates feared him. He was signing papers mechanically, his mind preoccupied with administrative matters. Then his personal assistant walked in and placed a thin, worn-out file on top of the stack. "Sir," the assistant said softly, "this is a report from the Social Welfare Department. It concerns a list of destitute elderly women in the rural district who are in urgent need of aid. The previous officers ignored it, but the local council has sent a final plea." David sighed, rubbing his temples. "Leave it. I'll look at it." He took a sip of water and opened the file. His eyes scanned the bureaucratic jargon, the list of names, the dry statistics of poverty. He turned the page. And then, time stopped. The world around him vanished. The air-conditioning hum faded into silence. There, on the third page, was a name that hit him with the force of a physical blow. Name, Maria. Husband, late Joseph. Village, St. Jude's Valley. Status, destitute widow. Son listed as missing for 10 years. Condition, living in a dilapidated hut. Health critical. Surviving on charity. David's hand froze. The pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. He stared at the name. Maria. His breath caught in his throat. He read the lines again, desperate to find a mistake, praying that it was a different Maria, a different village. But deep down he knew. The address was the same. The details were the same. And then, he saw the photograph attached to the corner of the page. It was a grainy black and white picture, likely taken for a ration card. The woman in the photo looked ancient, her eyes hollow, her face a map of suffering. But it was her. It was the face that had haunted his dreams for a decade. A sudden, sharp pain shot through David's chest. The mighty District Magistrate, who could order the demolition of buildings and the arrest of criminals, felt himself shrinking. He was suddenly 16 again, standing in the dark, clutching a bundle of clothes. The realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. His mother was alive. She wasn't dead. She wasn't fine. She was starving. She was waiting. And the report said son listed as missing. She hadn't disowned him. She hadn't declared him dead to the world. She was still waiting for him. David felt a lump rise in his throat, so large it threatened to choke him. His vision blurred. A tear, hot and heavy, splashed onto the official document, smearing the ink on the word missing. He gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white. The image of the broken hut, the rain leaking through the roof, the empty pot, it all flashed before his eyes. He had slept on soft mattresses while she slept on a broken cot. He had eaten at banquets while she begged for rice. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice trembling, breaking the silence of the office. "What have I done?" He hit the intercom button. His hands were shaking so badly he missed it twice. "Prepare the car," he ordered, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears, hoarse, broken and urgent. "Now. Cancel all meetings. And no sirens. No escort." "Sir?" his assistant asked, confused. "Where are we going?" David stood up, grabbing the file, holding it against his chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He looked out the window towards the distant hills where his village lay hidden. "Home," he whispered. "I am going home." The official car sped down the highway, leaving the towering skyline of the city behind, but David could not outrun the storm raging within his own chest. The air conditioning hummed a soft, monotonous rhythm, chilling the sweat that had gathered on his forehead, yet he felt as though he were burning up from the inside. His driver, a man named Samuel who had served him for 2 years, glanced repeatedly in the rearview mirror. He had never seen the magistrate like this, disheveled, tie loosened, eyes red and swollen, clutching a dusty file to his chest as if it were a holy scripture. Samuel knew better than to ask questions. He simply pressed his foot harder on the accelerator, sensing that this journey was not about inspection or governance, but about something far more desperate. As the concrete jungle gave way to open fields and the golden hue of the setting sun, David's mind began to drift, pulled back by the gravity of the past he had tried so hard to bury. The file in his lap felt heavy, weighing down not just his legs but his very soul. 10 years. He closed his eyes, and the darkness of those years washed over him. He remembered the first night in the city. He had arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of misplaced pride. The city was a monster that chewed up the weak, and David had been very, very weak. He remembered the gnawing hunger that felt like a wild animal clawing at his stomach. He remembered the smell of the cheap roadside diner where he had begged for work. The owner, a greasy man with a perpetual scowl, had thrown a rag at him and told him to scrub the tables. And David, the boy whose mother had worked herself to the bone so he wouldn't have to, had scrubbed. He scrubbed until his fingers bled, until the smell of stale curry and dishwater became his perfume. He slept on the cold, hard floor of the kitchen, curled up next to the sacks of onions, shivering as the rats scurried past him in the dark. But it was in that darkness that the fire had been kindled. He remembered the day he found a torn, discarded textbook in the trash behind a school. It was an English grammar book, missing the first 10 pages. He had wiped off the grime and opened it. That night, under the flickering yellow street lamp outside the diner, David began to read. He read with a hunger far greater than the one in his belly. Words became his weapons. Numbers became his shield. He worked 16 hours a day, serving tea and washing plates, and then studied for 4 hours when the world slept. He remembered the mockery of the customers. "Look at the scholar," they would sneer, flicking ash onto the floor he had just cleaned. Going to be a big man, are you, boy? David never answered them. He stored their insults in the furnace of his ambition, using them to burn brighter. He moved from the diner to a garage, then to a library assistant's job where he could read for free. He saved every penny, starving himself to buy forms for the civil services examination. He became a ghost, haunting the halls of knowledge, driven by a singular terrifying thought: I cannot go back as a failure. He had convinced himself that his mother hated him, that she had cast him out. He thought the only way to earn his place back in the world was to conquer it. And he had. He had conquered the exams, the interviews, the training. He had risen to become the District Magistrate, the man who held the power to change lives. But as the car bumped over a pothole, jolting him back to the present, David looked down at the file again. Destitute. Starving. While he was busy conquering the world, his mother was slowly dying of neglect. His ambition suddenly felt like a disease. What good was the power to sign checks for millions if he couldn't buy his mother a loaf of bread? What good was the authority to command police forces if he couldn't protect the one woman who had shielded him from the harsh sun with her own sari? The guilt was a physical pain, sharp and suffocating, lodging itself in his throat. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and charcoal grey when the car finally slowed down. They had reached the outskirts of St. Jude's Valley. The landscape was painfully familiar. The old banyan tree where he used to swing as a child stood like a silent sentinel. The small chapel on the hill, its cross silhouetted against the dying light, looked down upon the valley just as it always had. The air here was different. It smelled of wet earth, wood smoke, and memories. "Stop here," David commanded, his voice hoarse. "But sir," Samuel hesitated, "the village is still a mile in. The road is rough, but the car can make it." "I said stop," David snapped, then softened his tone. "Please, Samuel. Wait here. I need to walk." David stepped out of the car. The cool evening breeze hit his face, carrying the sound of the church bell ringing for the Angelus. Ding, ding, ding. The sound vibrated through his bones. He loosened his tie further and took off his blazer, tossing it onto the car seat. He couldn't walk into his village, wearing the armor of a bureaucrat. He rolled up his sleeves and began to walk. The path was dusty and uneven, just as he remembered. He walked past the fields where he used to run, past the well where the women gathered. Some villagers were walking home, carrying bundles of firewood or farming tools. They glanced at him, a tall, well-dressed stranger walking with a determined yet heavy gait, but none recognized him. To them, David was a ghost, a boy who had vanished into the mist of time. David kept his head down, afraid to meet their eyes, afraid they would see the shame burning in his own. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that grew louder with every step. Thump, 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 thump. He was approaching the edge of the village, the place where the poorest lived, the place where civilization ended and the forest began. And then he saw it. The hut. David stopped dead in his tracks. A gasp escaped his lips, a sound of pure anguish. In his memories, the hut was poor but sturdy. But the structure that stood before him now was a ruin. The mud walls had eroded, leaving gaping holes that looked like dark, screaming mouths. The roof was a mess of rotting straw and plastic sheets held down by stones. It looked like a strong wind would blow it away entirely. It was the house of a beggar, a forgotten soul. And right there, sitting on a broken string cot outside the leaning door, was a figure. It was Maria. She was smaller than he remembered. Fragile. Her body was curved into a permanent bow, her head resting on her knees. She looked like a bundle of old clothes discarded by the roadside. David's vision blurred with tears. He wanted to run to her, but his legs felt like lead. He forced himself to move, one painful step at a time. The dry leaves crunched under his expensive leather shoes. At the sound of footsteps, the figure on the cot stirred. Maria lifted her head slowly. Her movements were pained, stiff with arthritis. She squinted into the gathering darkness, her eyes clouded and dim. She couldn't see his face, just a silhouette standing at the edge of her yard. "Who is it?" she called out. Her voice, oh God, her voice, it was thin, cracked like dry parchment, trembling with age and weakness. It wasn't the strong, booming voice that used to scold him. It was the voice of a woman who had spent too many years talking only to silence. David couldn't speak. The word mother was stuck in his throat, a jagged stone he couldn't swallow. He took another step closer. "Is someone there?" Maria asked again, fear creeping into her tone. "I have nothing to give, no money. Please." The realization that she thought he was a thief, or worse, broke the last of David's composure. He choked back a sob and managed to whisper, "Water. Do you have some water?" Maria paused. The request seemed to confuse her. A stranger asking for water? In her culture, denying water was a sin, even for the poorest. She sighed, a heavy, rattling sound, and grabbed the side of the cot to pull herself up. "Wait," she wheezed. I will check." She stood up, her legs shaking violently under her own weight. She turned and shuffled into the dark hut. David watched her, his heart bleeding. He saw her fumble in the darkness. He heard the clinking of metal. She came back out holding an old, dented tin cup. Her hands were trembling so much that the water was sloshing over the brim, dripping onto her bare, calloused feet. She held the cup out towards the shadow standing before her. "Here," she said softly. "Drink. It is fresh." David stepped into the faint pool of light cast by the rising moon. He reached out and wrapped his hands around hers, cup and all. Her skin was rough like tree bark, but warm. The moment his skin touched hers, a shockwave seemed to pass through them both. Maria froze. She didn't pull away. She stood there, holding the cup, breathing heavily. David didn't drink. He couldn't. He slowly lowered the cup, letting it slip from their grasp. It hit the soft earth with a dull thud, spilling the water and offering to the thirsty earth. David fell to his knees. He didn't kneel like a subject before a queen, but like a sinner before a saint. He collapsed onto the dust, wrapping his arms around her frail, stick-thin legs. He buried his face in the hem of her torn, faded skirt. "Mother!" The word finally tore itself free from his chest, a desperate, broken cry. "Mother! I have come back." Maria stood frozen, like a statue carved from grief. The cup lay at her feet. The man, this stranger in fine clothes, was weeping at her feet, his body shaking with violent sobs. But that voice, that single word, it echoed through the chambers of her memory, unlocking doors she had sealed shut 10 years ago. She slowly, tentatively reached down. Her shaking hand touched his head. She felt the texture of his hair. She traced the shape of his ear, a habit she had when he was a baby. Her fingers moved to his face, now wet with tears. She felt the jawline, the nose. Her blindness was no hindrance now. Her fingers saw what her eyes could not. "David," she whispered, the name barely more than a breath. Is it really you?" David looked up, his face streaming with tears, his eyes red and raw. "Yes, mother. It is me. It is your David. I am here. I am alive." A sound escaped Maria's throat, a sound that was neither a laugh nor a cry, but something primal, something that ripped through the night air. "My son!" she screamed, her strength suddenly returning. She fell to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him into her chest. "Oh Lord! Oh sweet Jesus! You heard me. You heard me." She rocked him back and forth, kissing his forehead, his cheeks, his hands. She touched his face repeatedly, as if to ensure he wouldn't dissolve into mist. "I thought you were dead. I thought the earth had swallowed you. 10 years, David, 10 years I waited. I kept the door unlocked every night." "I'm sorry, mother." David sobbed into her shoulder, clutching her as if he were a drowning man, and she was the only driftwood in the ocean. "I'm so sorry. I was a coward. I was angry. Please forgive me, punish me, hit me, but don't say I'm not your son. Please." "Hush," Maria wept, wiping his tears with her dirty, tattered shawl. "Hush now. A mother does not punish the part of her own soul that returns to her. You are here. That is all that matters. The Lord has returned my light." They sat there in the dust, under the vast canopy of starlight, holding on to each other as if the world around them had ceased to exist. The district magistrate was gone. The poor widow was gone. There was only a mother and her child, bridging a decade of distance with tears. But the village of St. Jude's was not a place where secrets stayed quiet. The sound of Maria's scream, the presence of the strange car at the village entrance, and the figure weeping at the widow's hut had caught attention. Lanterns began to flicker to life in the neighboring huts. Doors creaked open. "What is happening at Maria's place?" a neighbor shouted. "Is she ill? Did she fall?" "I saw a man go there, a stranger." Footsteps began to crunch on the gravel path. Beams of torchlight cut through the darkness, swinging wildly as the villagers, led by the village elder old Mr. Thomas, hurried towards the commotion. They arrived to find a scene that defied explanation. The destitute widow Maria sitting on the ground, embracing a man in a suit who was weeping like a child. Mr. Thomas raised his lantern, the yellow light illuminating David's face as he slowly pulled away from his mother and looked towards the gathering crowd. The villagers gasped. Murmurs rippled through the group like wind through dry grass. "Is that? It looks like Joseph's boy." "David? The one who ran away?" David stood up, helping his mother to her feet. He dusted off his knees, his face streaked with dirt and tears, but his eyes suddenly regaining a spark of that steel that made him who he was. He looked at the faces of the villagers, faces he knew, faces that had aged. He saw judgment, he saw curiosity, and he saw shock. Mr. Thomas stepped forward, squinting. "David? Is that truly you?" David took a deep breath, holding Maria's hand firmly in his own. "Yes, Uncle Thomas. It is me." The villagers exchanged stunned glances. "Look at his clothes," a woman whispered loud enough to be heard. "He looks like a rich man, like an officer." "Where have you been, boy?" someone shouted from the back. "Leaving your mother to rot like this while you wear suits?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. David felt the sting of it, sharp and true. He deserved it. He looked at the dilapidated hut, then at his mother's frail form, and then at the crowd. The shame was there, yes, but now, something else was rising within him, a fierce determination. The time for weeping was over. The time for action had begun. The question hung in the night air, heavy with accusation and years of accumulated judgment. "Where have you been, boy?" The villager's voice was rough, like grinding stones. "Leaving your mother to rot in this hovel while you wear fine linen and drive fancy cars? Have you no shame?" David stood there, his expensive Italian leather shoes coated in the dust of the village he had abandoned. The silence that followed was suffocating. The crowd of villagers, holding their lanterns and torches high, formed a circle of light around the mother and son, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. To them, David was just a prodigal son who had returned too late, a man who had traded his soul for wealth. David looked at the faces in the crowd. He saw Mr. Thomas, the old church warden, whose hair had turned completely white. He saw Mrs. Gable, who used to give him sweets when he was a toddler. He saw the judgment in their eyes, and he knew he deserved every ounce of it. He tightened his grip on Maria's frail hand, feeling the trembling of her bones beneath her thin skin. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. The vulnerability of the weeping son vanished, replaced instantly by the steely composure of the district magistrate. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. He spoke with a quiet, resonant authority that cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. "I have no defense for my absence," David began, his voice steady, despite the emotional storm raging within him. "I left as a coward, and for that, I will carry the guilt for the rest of my days. But I did not leave to seek pleasure. I left to seek power. Not for myself, but to ensure that no one, no widow, no orphan, no mother in this valley, would ever have to beg for dignity again." He paused, looking directly at the man who had shouted at him. "You ask what I have become? You ask where I have been?" David stepped forward, the light from the lanterns catching the sharp lines of his face. "My name is David Joseph, and I am the district magistrate of this entire region." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the gathering. The murmuring stopped instantly, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. The district magistrate, the highest authority in the district, the man who signed the laws, who controlled the police, who held the power of the state in his pen. This boy? Joseph's son? The runaway? It seemed impossible, a fairy tale woven into the harsh reality of their lives. Mr. Thomas dropped his cane. His mouth fell open, and he took a step back, his eyes wide with disbelief. "The magistrate," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Little David, is the magistrate?" Maria, still clutching David's arm, looked up at him with confusion clouding her milky eyes. The title meant little to her in terms of bureaucracy, but she sensed the shift in the atmosphere. She felt the fear and awe radiating from the neighbors who had gathered. "David," she asked softly, "what are they saying? What have you become?" David looked down at her, his expression softening into pure love. He knelt again so he could be eye level with her, ignoring the dirt staining his trousers. "It means, Mother, that I have the power to fix this," he said gently. "It means you will never be hungry again." The shock in the crowd slowly gave way to a different kind of tension. The villagers who moments ago were ready to scold him now shuffled their feet nervously. They realized that the man standing before them could demolish their homes or save them with a single order. The dynamic had shifted violently. David stood up and turned to Mr. Thomas. "Uncle Thomas," he said, his voice respectful but firm. "My mother has lived in this hut for 10 years. The roof leaks. There is no food in the kitchen. I saw the records. The council funds for the destitute widows. Why did they never reach her?" Mr. Thomas stammered, wringing his hands. "David, sir, the funds are scarce. The block office, they said the paperwork was incomplete. We tried, truly. But you know how the government works. It is a slow beast." "I am the government," David said, his voice cold and sharp, "and I know exactly how it works. It works when people do their jobs. It stops when they don't." He looked around at the dilapidated state of the neighboring huts, realizing that his mother wasn't the only one suffering. His heart ached not just for her, but for the entire village that had been left behind by the march of progress. "But tonight is not for audits. Tonight is for my mother." He turned to his driver Samuel, who had silently walked up from the car carrying a flashlight and a bag of emergency supplies he always kept in the trunk. "Samuel," David ordered, "bring the first aid kit. And whatever food we have in the car. Biscuits, water, fruit. Bring it all." "Yes, sir," Samuel said, sprinting back towards the vehicle. The villagers watched in awe as the district magistrate took the bag from his driver and gently guided his mother back towards the hut. "Come, Mother," he said. "Let's go inside." But it is a mess, David," Maria protested weakly, trying to smooth down her torn skirt. "It is not fit for a magistrate. There is no chair. The roof. It is my home," David said simply, "and it is the only place I want to be." He led her into the darkness of the hut. Samuel followed with a high-powered flashlight, illuminating the interior. What David saw inside broke his heart all over again. The floor was uneven mud. In the corner, a small kerosene stove sat, cold and empty. A few aluminum pots, dented and black with soot, were stacked near a water pot that was half empty. The bed was a charpoy with a thin, ragged blanket. On the wall, however, hung a pristine framed picture of Jesus, and next to it a small faded photograph of a young David. It was the only clean spot in the house. David took off his suit jacket and hung it on a nail protruding from the mud wall. He rolled up his white shirt sleeves, exposing his forearms. "Samuel, you can wait in the car. Or find a place in the village to rest. I'm staying here tonight." "Here, sir?" Samuel asked, eyeing the leaking roof. "Sir, the circuit house is only 20 miles away. We can take Madam there. It will be comfortable." "No," David said, his tone final. "I will sleep where my mother sleeps. Go." As Samuel left, the crowd outside began to disperse, whispering excitedly about the miracle they had witnessed. Inside, the silence returned, but this time it was intimate, filled with the warmth of reunion. David sat on the edge of the charpoy next to Maria. He opened the packet of biscuits and a bottle of mineral water. "Eat, Mother," he said, breaking a biscuit and holding it to her lips. Maria took a bite, chewing slowly with her toothless gums. She looked at him, her eyes tracing his features in the dim light of the flashlight he had set on the floor. "You look like your father," she whispered. "You have his chin. And his stubbornness." David smiled, a sad, weary smile. "I missed you, Mother. Every single day. I thought you hated me for leaving." Maria put the biscuit down and took his hand in both of hers. Her hands were rough, calloused maps of her suffering. "Hate you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "David, a mother can be angry. She can be hurt, but she can never hate the life she brought into this world. When you left, I didn't cry because I was angry. I cried because I failed you. I thought I drove you away." "No," David shook his head, tears welling up again. "You didn't drive me away. My own shame did. I wanted to be worthy of you. I wanted to come back when I could give you the world." He looked around the wretched hut. "But I waited too long. I gave you the world, but I left you in hell for 10 years. You are here now," Maria said firmly. "That is all the heaven I need." They sat in silence for a while, the years of separation melting away in the quiet hum of the night. Then David cleared his throat. "Mother, pack your things. Tomorrow morning, a car will come. We are going to the city. I have a big house. There are servants, a garden, a proper church nearby. You will have a soft bed and doctors to look after your eyes. You will never have to live in this filth again." He expected her to agree immediately. Who wouldn't want to escape this misery? But Maria went still. She withdrew her hands slowly. She looked towards the corner of the hut where an old rusted trunk lay. "No, David," she said softly. David blinked. "No? Mother, you don't understand. I am the magistrate. I can give you everything. Why would you want to stay here?" Maria sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. "My son, you are a big man now. You belong to this city. You belong to the government. But I belong to this soil." She gestured to the mud floor. "Your father built this hut with his own hands. He died in this very room. His memories are in these walls. When the wind blows at night, I can still hear his voice. If I leave this place, I leave him." "But mother," David argued, his voice rising with desperation, "this place is killing you. It's falling apart." "Then fix it," she said, looking at him with a sudden fierce clarity. "If you are as powerful as you say, then fix this hut. But do not ask me to leave the ground where my husband is buried. Do not ask me to leave the people who gave me rice when my own son was gone." David stared at her. He saw the resolve in her fragile frame. He realized then that power wasn't just about command and control, it was about understanding. He had conquered the district, but he couldn't conquer his mother's heart with orders. She was rooted here, like the ancient banyan tree outside. Uprooting her would kill her spirit. He let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, mother. If you won't come to my palace, I will bring the palace to you." Maria smiled, patting his cheek. "That is my good boy." The night deepened. The village went to sleep, but the light in the last hut burned on. David didn't sleep much. He lay on a straw mat on the floor, refusing to take the bed from his mother. He watched her sleep, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, terrified that if he closed his eyes, she might vanish. He watched the shadows dance on the crumbling walls and made a list in his head. Not a list of files or judgments, but a list of bricks, cement, doctors, and pensions. Around 3 a.m., David woke up from a fitful doze. He saw Maria sitting up in her bed, clutching her rosary, staring at him in the dark. "What is it, mother?" he whispered. "Are you in pain?" "No," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I am just looking. I spent 10 years staring at that door, imagining you walking through it. Now that you are here, sleeping on this floor, I am afraid to blink." David got up and sat beside her. He took her hand and kissed it. "I am not going anywhere, mother. I promise. I am here." "David," she asked hesitantly, "is it true? Are you really the magistrate? The one who judges?" "Yes, mother." "Then judge me," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "Judge me for that night. Judge me for raising my hand against you. I have carried that sin for 10 years. Tell me I am forgiven." David felt his heart shatter. The irony of it, she was asking for his forgiveness when he was the one who had abandoned her. He hugged her tight, resting his head on her shoulder as he had done when he was a child. "There is no judgment here, mother," he choked out. "Only love. You hit me to save me. And that slap woke me up. If you hadn't done that, I would have been a drunkard in a ditch somewhere. You didn't sin, mother. You saved me. You made me who I am." They cried then, holding each other in the dark, washing away the pain of a decade. The district magistrate who made hardened criminals tremble wept like a baby in the arms of a woman who owned nothing but her faith. And in that embrace, the broken hut felt more majestic than any government bungalow. As the first rooster crowed in the distance, signaling the approach of dawn, David pulled away. He looked at his mother's face, peaceful now, the lines of worry slightly smoothed by his presence. "Sleep for a while, mother," he said. "Today is going to be a long day." "Why?" she asked. David stood up, walking to the door of the hut and looking out at the sleeping village. The sky was turning a pale, bruised blue. A fire lit up in his eyes, not the fire of anger that had driven him away, but the fire of duty that had brought him back. "Because," David said, his voice low and dangerous, "today the district magistrate is going to hold court. Not in the city, but right here. And God help anyone who has failed this village." He turned back to Maria, buttoning his sleeves. The transformation was complete. The son had comforted the mother, now the administrator would avenge her. The sun was about to rise over St. Jude's Valley, and with it a reckoning was coming. The sun rose over St. Jude's Valley, not with its usual lazy warmth, but with a tension that electrified the morning air. The mist that clung to the pine trees seemed to part eagerly, revealing a spectacle the sleepy hamlet had never witnessed before. By 7 in the morning, the narrow potholed road leading to the village was choked with a convoy of white government SUVs. Dust clouds billowed into the sky as the heavy vehicles navigated the rough terrain, their engines growling like beasts invading a sanctuary. There were no sirens, as David had commanded, but the sheer presence of the district's administrative machinery was louder than any alarm. Inside the dilapidated hut, David was already awake. He had spent the night on the floor beside his mother's charpoy, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, a sound that soothed the decade-long storm in his heart. He washed his face at the rusted hand pump in the backyard, the icy water stinging his skin, waking him fully to the reality of the day. He didn't have his pressed suit jacket anymore, it hung on a nail on the mud wall. He stood in his white shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his trousers stained with the red earth of his home. Yet as he walked out to the front yard, he looked more authoritative than he ever had in his air-conditioned office. The villagers had gathered in a wide semicircle, whispering, pointing, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. They watched as the cars came to a halt. Doors flew open and out stepped the hierarchy of the district, the block development officer, Mr. Henderson, the chief engineer, Mr. Clark, the local police sergeant Miller, and the village council head. They looked terrified. They had received the call at dawn. The district magistrate was in St. Jude's, and he was not happy. They stumbled out of their cars, straightening their ties, wiping sweat from their foreheads despite the morning chill, their polished shoes sinking into the mud. David dragged a simple wooden chair from a neighbor's porch and placed it squarely in front of his mother's crumbling hut. He sat down, crossing his legs, and watched the officials approach. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply waited until they were lined up before him like errant schoolboys. "Good morning, gentlemen," David said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Welcome to my home." Mr. Henderson, the BDO, stepped forward, his hand shaking as he held a file. "Good morning, sir. We didn't know you were visiting. If we had known, we would have arranged a reception at the guest house." "A reception?" David raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Henderson, look behind me." He gestured to the ruin of a house where his mother sat, watching from the doorway. "This is where my mother has lived for 10 years. The roof leaks. The walls are falling. She has no food. And you want to talk about receptions?" Henderson gulped. "Sir, the funds, the paperwork." "Stop," David said, cutting him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I have the file. 35 widows in this village. Only 12 are receiving their pension. The rest are marked as pending verification or insufficient funds. My mother is on that list. Tell me, Henderson, when you go home tonight to your warm house and your full dinner table, do you think about the women who built this district starving in the dark?" "Sir, it's a budget issue from the state." Henderson tried to argue, his voice thin. David stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the dirt. "It is not a budget issue. It is a conscience issue. It is a failure of duty." He walked up to Henderson, standing inches from his face. "You have until sunset. I want the pension released for every single eligible widow in St. Jude's. Not just the paperwork, I want the money in their accounts or cash in their hands today. If I find a single woman in this valley sleeping hungry tonight because of your process, you will be suspended before the sun goes down. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir." "Absolutely, sir." Henderson practically squeaked, clutching his files to his chest. Next, David turned to Sergeant Miller. "Sergeant, I see old Mr. Fernandez standing there in the crowd." He pointed to a withered old man leaning on a cane. "He came to the station 3 months ago. His land, 2 acres by the river, was fenced off by the local landlord. He filed a complaint." "What did you do?" Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, it's a civil matter, disputed territory." "It is theft," David snapped. "I checked the land registry last night on the portal. The land belongs to Fernandez. The landlord is bullying him and you are looking the other way because perhaps the landlord buys you tea? Or is it something more than tea?" The sergeant went pale. "Go," David ordered, pointing toward the river. "Take your men. Tear down that fence. Restore the land to Mr. Fernandez. And file an FIR against the landlord for trespassing and intimidation. If that fence is standing when I leave this village, You will be manning a traffic post in the middle of nowhere for the rest of your career. Move! The sergeant saluted hurriedly and ran toward his jeep, barking orders at his constables. The villagers watched in stunned silence. They had seen officers before, but they had never seen justice. They were used to being ignored, to being told to wait, to being asked for bribes. Today, they were watching the machinery of the state being forced to work for them, greased by the anger of a son who remembered his roots. Maria stepped out of the hut, holding a glass of water. Her hands were shaking, not from age this time, but from overwhelming emotion. She walked up to David. The officials watched, unsure of what to do. "Son," she whispered, "drink. You have been shouting." David's expression softened instantly. He took the glass, drank, and then turned to the trembling officials. "Gentlemen, meet Mrs. Maria Joseph." "My mother." He paused, letting the weight of the introduction sink in. "And every elderly woman in this village is now your responsibility. Treat them as you would treat the woman who gave you birth. Because if you don't, I will personally ensure you answer for it." By noon, the atmosphere in St. Jude's had transformed. It wasn't just fear of the magistrate, it was the infection of hope. Mr. Clark, the engineer, was already taking measurements of the plot. David had given him specific instructions. "I don't want a mansion, Clark," David said, standing by the broken wall where his father's picture hung. "I want a home. 2 bedrooms. A sturdy roof that sounds like a drum when it rains, but doesn't let a drop in. A kitchen with a gas connection. And a prayer room. A proper one, facing the church. Can you do it?" "Consider it done, sir," Clark said, sketching rapidly. "We will start the foundation tomorrow. It will be the strongest house in the valley." As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of violet and burnt orange, the urgent work of the day began to wind down. The sergeant had returned, the fence was gone, and Mr. Fernandez was weeping with gratitude, clutching his land deed. The BDO had set up a camp table and was distributing pension arrears in cash, verified by the village council. The smoke from cooking fires began to rise, but tonight, the pots were full. David sat with Maria on the charpoy one last time. The convoy was ready to leave. The red beacon on his car, though unlit, caught the dying light of the sun. "Mother," David said gently, taking her hand. "The house will be built in 2 months. But until then, please, come with me. The city is not so bad. You can visit the big cathedral. You can rest." Maria looked at him, her eyes clear and filled with a profound peace. She looked at the busy village, at the children playing near the cars, at the neighbors who were finally smiling. Then she looked at the soil beneath her feet. "David," she said, her voice steady, "you are a good son. You have washed away every sin, every mistake of the past today. But my answer is the same. Look at this ground. Your father walked here. I walked here as a bride. You took your first steps here. If I leave, who will light the candle at your father's grave on All Souls' Day? Who will tell the stories of this valley?" She cupped his face. "You belong to the world now, my son. You have a duty to thousands. But I belong to St. Jude's. My roots are too deep to be pulled up without killing the tree. Let me stay. Build me this house and I will live here like a queen, waiting for your visits." David knew she was right. He realized that dragging her to a sterile city apartment would be a cruelty, not a kindness. She drew her strength from this land, from the memories of Joseph, from the community that had shared her suffering. "Okay, mother," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "I will come every month. I promise. And bring me a shawl next time," she chuckled, wiping a tear from his eye. "A blue one? Like the Virgin Mary wears?" "I will bring you 100 blue shawls," David laughed, a sound that felt free and light. David walked to his car. The villagers lined the path, no longer looking at him with suspicion or judgment, but with pride. Mr. Thomas stepped forward and placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Your father, Joseph, he would have been the proudest man on earth today, David. You didn't just come back. You brought the light back." David nodded, unable to speak, and climbed into the car. As the convoy rolled away, he watched through the rear window. He saw the silhouette of his mother standing tall against the twilight, waving, surrounded by her people. She wasn't the lonely, destitute widow anymore. She was the mother of the magistrate, the matriarch of St. Jude's. Months turned into years. The hut was replaced by a modest, beautiful brick house, painted a soft cream color. It had a porch where Maria sat every evening, wrapped in a blue shawl, telling stories to the village children. The village flourished. The road was paved, the school was repaired, and the clinic was staffed. David kept his promise. His white car would be seen winding up the valley road regularly. Sometimes he came as the magistrate to inspect. Mostly, he came as a son to eat his mother's simple curry and sleep under the roof he had built. 5 years later, a transfer order arrived. David was promoted to the state capital, a position of immense power and responsibility. On his last visit before the move, he sat with Maria in the new prayer room, the candle flickering before the crucifix. "I have to go far away, Mother," he said. "I might not be able to come as often." Maria smiled, her face lined with age but glowing with contentment. "Go, my son. You have done your work here. The bird must fly to new forests. But remember," she tapped his chest, right over his heart, "your compass is here. Power is a heavy coat to wear, David. It can make you forget who you are. But as long as you remember the smell of this mud and the taste of the tears you cried that night, you will be a just man." "I will never forget," David vowed. David left, and though his visits became fewer, his legacy remained woven into the very fabric of the valley. Maria lived for another peaceful 7 years, passing away quietly in her sleep in the house her son built, clutching the rosary he had bought her. When she died, the entire district mourned. David returned one last time to carry her coffin, walking the same dusty path he had fled as a boy, but this time as a man who had fulfilled his penance. Today, if you travel to St. Jude's Valley, you will see a neat little house with a plaque on the gate, Villa Maria. It stands not as a monument to a bureaucrat's wealth, but as a testament to a son's redemption. And perhaps this is the greatest truth of this story. We often think success is about how far we can get from our humble beginnings, about how high we can climb. But true success is a circle. It is the journey of climbing the mountain, acquiring the strength, and then coming back down to lift up those we left behind. A true magistrate is not the one who rules a district from a high tower. The true magistrate is the one who can rule his own heart, who can kneel in the dust before his mother, and who understands that the greatest law of all is love. If this story has touched you, do not just listen to it. Let it be a mirror. Somewhere, there might be a Maria waiting for you. Somewhere, there is a bridge you burned that needs rebuilding. Do not wait for 10 years. Do not wait for a file to land on your desk. Go home. Make the call. Forgive. Because in the end, the only title that truly matters is not sir, or manager, or officer. It is son, daughter, brother, friend. That is the only rank that goes with us when the final file is closed. The end.